Everyone loves a good redemption story. Yes, whether it's someone you know personally who gets their act together, or someone you admire from afar who falls on the right path at last, it's always a great thing to witness. And of course, wrestling is no stranger to this kind of thing either. But what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the rise, fall, and rise again of Dustin Rhodes. Now, back in the late 80s and early 90s, Dustin Rhodes was someone who seemed like he had the world at his feet. After all, he was a fantastic athlete and one of the best young wrestlers out there, someone good enough to earn the nickname of the Natural. On top of this, he was also the son of the legendary Dusty Rhodes, so it felt like his path to superstardom would be about as smooth could be. Unfortunately for him, though, Dustin was also a man of many vices, and these vices would get the better of him on more than one occasion. Hell, at various points throughout the 90s and the 2000s, his addiction issues would almost see him fall apart completely. Really, there were times when he was working for TNA under the Black Rain gimmick, or when he was portraying the artist formerly known as Goldust in WWF, that things looked rough for him. But he'd turn things around in the end. Yes, over the years, he would gradually get himself clean again, with this getting him to the point he's at today. Sure, it would be a rocky road and not one which he traversed overnight, but after a long period of fighting, slipping, and getting back on the wagon again, Dustin Rhodes was at last able to say he was completely sober. And that's a status he's maintained for 17 years as of 2025. That's right, it really is a redemption story in the truest sense of the word, particularly because, even if he doesn't wrestle that much anymore, whenever he does, the bizarre one still looks great. But then that's the power of getting clean, because, as in his case at least, it's allowed the Texan to turn back the clock by several years. And Dustin Rhodes isn't the only prominent wrestler from the 90s who suffered with a lot of addiction issues who had to fight hard just to get clean over the years. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Scott Hall. Yes, this is a man who is arguably the best wrestler to never win a world title, despite always being one of the top performers in any promotion he was in. But then to be fair, given all the demons he had back then, no booker could have him in that position. And that meant he'd always remain at a slightly lower level. What caused Scott to fall into this lifestyle? Some serious unresolved trauma. Trauma which originated when he shot a man in self-defense during a bar fight back during his younger days. Obviously then, it left him a very damaged man in the years which followed, but while this would end up being an issue throughout his entire in-ring career, there was a very happy ending here, as in his later years, the bad guy would be able to get clean and sober finally, all with the help of Diamond Dallas Page. Yes, it was after taking Hall into his home in 2013 that DDP was able to get the former Intercontinental Champion back on the right path, a path he'd be able to remain on for the most part of the rest of his days. Sure, like with many addicts, there would be slip-ups here and there, but these aside, Scott could safely say he'd largely beaten his demons by the time of his passing in March of 2022, and that makes him one of the greatest redemption stories in all of wrestling. Of course, this story also tells a tale of how great a man Diamond Dallas Page is, one of the better people the industry has given us in fact, as he was willing to take a man at the end of his tether into his life full-time and bring him back from the brink, for no other reason than because it was the right thing to do. And that wouldn't be the only time DDP would save another wrestler's life either. No, the same thing would happen when he took it upon himself to help our next subject, the man known as Jake the Snake Roberts. That's right, like with Scott Hall, Jake Roberts is one of those great what-ifs in wrestling, because despite being very successful in the ring, and despite being one of the greatest promos of all time, maybe the greatest, he really never achieved as much as he should have. No, here was another legend who never got that world title, or that push as the top guy at any point. Obviously though, there were reasons for this, and those reasons were that back during the 80s and 90s, Jake had major addiction issues. Why was this? Well, like with Scott Hall, Roberts had a very traumatic past, and this led to him eventually trying to drown out his demons in any way he could. So it was then that during his years as a wrestler, bookers became cautious about pushing him too high up the card. But like with Scott Hall, Jake Roberts would eventually be able to pull himself out of this hole, and the way he'd do so would be through the help of Diamond Dallas Page. Yes, it was in 2012 that the Snake moved in with DDP and began a rehab regimen, much of which was captured in the excellent documentary The Resurrection of Jake the Snake. Has he had the odd fall here and there since this point? Sure, but for the vast majority of the time, since 2012, Roberts has been able to stay clean, and that's even allowed him to return to TV for both WWE and AEW. In fact, it's AEW who employs him to this day as a manager, with that only giving him more motivation to stay clean every morning when he wakes up. We just hope we get many more years out of him in this role then, as with him as a coach, there's so much he can teach the next generation of performers coming up today. But not everyone who has their redemption in wrestling gets this as a result of beating addiction. No, sometimes it can simply be getting fired and finding your way back to your old job which does that, as was the case with our next subject, the one, the only, Drew McIntyre. Now, we all know Drew McIntyre today as one of the best performers in all of wrestling, but back during the early 2010s, things were not going so well for him. And that was because after an early run where he was being positioned as the next chosen one of WWE, the Scotsman had found himself falling to the point that he was pretty much a jobber. That's right, as a member of 3MB, it looked like the Scottish psychopath was destined to become a cautionary tale, someone who could have had the world at his feet but ended up with nothing. And this feeling was only solidified when he was fired by WWE in 2014. Thankfully though, that would not be the last we heard of the Air native. No, rather than disappear into obscurity in the years following, Drew would dust himself off and become a stalwart of his local indie scene. And that would all eventually lead him to TNA, a place where he could get back on TV and show what he was still capable of. Thank God he did this then, because eventually his former employer would start to take note of his actions once more. What would be the end result of such notice? Well, in 2017, McIntyre would be rehired by WWE. And this started an ascent which eventually saw him win the Royal Rumble in January of 2020, and from there, go on to beat Brock Lesnar for the WWE title at WrestleMania 36. Sure, the shine would be taken off of this moment somewhat by the fact that it happened during the worldwide shutdown, so no fans were allowed in attendance, but at very least, it turned Drew into a made man in WWE, and it also helped to fuel his eventual heel turn where he's shown in recent years. Yes, ever since his comeback to WWE, Drew McIntyre has been getting better as time goes on, and has been turning into a bigger star because of that. Really, the only thing left for him to do at this point is to win that world title again, this time in front of the fans, and hold on to the thing for more than a few minutes. If he can achieve that goal, then the Scotsman will finally be vindicated in full as his story will be completed. But then he wouldn't be the first person to leave WWE only to return again years later in order to finish their story, as the exact same thing happened with our next subject, Cody Rhodes. That's right, the biggest star in all of wrestling today, Cody Rhodes is about as made can be in 2025. Of course, if you go back to the mid-2010s though, things were very different for him. Why is that? Well, this was the period he was at a career low, stuck in mid-card hell playing Stardust, and having seemingly no hopes of ever breaking out of the pack despite the fact he was the son of the late great Dustin Rhodes. So, what did the American Nightmare do to get himself out of this hole then? He quit. Yes, in May of 2016, Cody requested his release from WWE and was granted it. And from there, he'd go on a journey which saw him hit the Indies, go to Japan where he became a member of the Bullet Club, and eventually serve as a founding father of All Elite Wrestling in 2019. And after that, the prodigal son would return home to WWE. Would proving he could be a star elsewhere be a positive for his hopes here? Yes, it would, as over the years which followed, the American Nightmare would become the company's top babyface star. Hell, such a big deal would he be that along with the bloodline, he's a key factor in WWE's hot streak ever since 2022. That's right, the moment he beat Roman Reigns at WrestleMania 40 to finish his story and become WWE champion has to be considered one of the greatest moments in WWE history. And that's an incredible thing to say given how low the Atlanta native was in the pecking order back in 2016. No one could have foreseen such things in Cody's future back then, but that's exactly why it's such a great redemption story, because he's been able to go from being just another guy to being one of the most important people in the industry. Yes, there's no way you can consider Rhodes anything less than a first ballot Hall of Famer in the present day. But let's move away from him for now and over to our next subject, someone who had a redemption story for a completely different reason, one which involved him finding religion after a long period of substance abuse. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Shawn Michaels. Now, it's not exactly a controversial statement to say that Shawn Michaels is one of the greatest wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots. Come on now, this has been true all throughout his career. It was even true back in the 90s when he was notoriously difficult to work with. But then part of the reason HBK was so difficult to work with here was because he was battling substance issues. What would this all lead to? Well, it would lead to Shawn alienating pretty much everyone around him, even his best friend Triple H. That's right, after a serious back injury temporarily ended his career at the turn of the millennium, Michaels fell so far into addiction in order to cope, those closest to him just couldn't take it anymore. And for a while, it looked like this was going to be a lasting legacy of the Texan. someone who was great but whose greatness was overshadowed by his personal life. Thankfully then, things would eventually change for him before he was too far gone, and they would change in the early 2000s. That was the point when Shawn got married to former Nitro girl Whisper, and after having a son, realized it was time he got his life together. Still though, even with this realization, the Heartbreak Kid was going to need help, and for him, that help came in the form of religion. Yes, it was here that Shawn was able to fully turn his life around, with him getting sober at this point. Not that his time in wrestling would be done forever here though. No, it was in 2002, after getting cleared to wrestle again, the San Antonio native returned to the ring and began a whole second career, one which was arguably even better than the first. And part of the reason it was better was because he could enjoy it this time without having to constantly drown himself in substances. On top of that, some of his best work in the ring came during this period, something which by all rights shouldn't have been the case for a man coming back from such a serious injury. But let's move away from HBK for now and on to our next subject, the late great Eddie Guerrero. That's right, Latino Heat was known for being someone who had his own problems with addiction. Sure, he was still able to go out in the ring and deliver in a big way as he did all throughout his WCW days, ECW days, and the early days of his WWF run. But possibly on account of his issues behind the curtain, it never felt like he was in line for a big push. So bad would things get for him at one point, he'd actually be fired from Vince McMahon's promotion in 2001, with this forcing the El Paso native to go on a bit of a run in the Indies as a king in exile for a while. And thankfully it was during this run that Eddie was finally able to get clean. And that led to him rebuilding his reputation behind the scenes to the point that WWE would come calling once again in 2002. Of course, even if he was now sober, the idea that Guerrero could ever reach the mountaintop in WWE felt like a stretch given his size. But some people are so talented, things like their height can't slow them down, and Eddie was one of those people. That's right, he was so good, so beloved, that in the end, WWE felt like they had no choice but to give him the world title when he beat Brock Lesnar for the honor at No Way Out in February of 2004. Yes, after all those years of struggling with addiction, Latino Heat had finally been able to get to the peak of his profession. It's just a shame this peak was so short-lived then, as only 1 year later he'd pass away. But even if this were the case, he was at least able to get clean for long enough to prove he was the best, even if it was only for a little while. But what of a peer of Eddie's from back in the day? He certainly had his own addiction issues over the years which he had to overcome. So let's take a look at him now, one of the greatest of all time, Kurt Angle. Now in Kurt Angle, we have someone who really paid the price for their art, because for as good as he was in the ring, and he was very, very good, his body suffered twice as much as a result. That's right, everything he did once his boots were laced up took an enormous toll on the Olympic hero. And that meant, as he was winning multiple world titles, all while having some of the best matches of his era in places like WWE and TNA, he was relying on pain medicine in order to get him through the day. Obviously then, it didn't take long for this to become a real problem for him. Such a big problem that WWE would actually part ways with him in 2006. Yes, when arguably the best wrestler in the world at the time gets fired from his job because he's too much of a liability, you know things are serious. But Kurt didn't seem to care about that. No, he was only too happy to move over to the Impact Zone and continue on living the same lifestyle there. Eventually though, it all became too much, and he realized that if he didn't get sober soon, he was risking paying the ultimate price. So that's what he did, as it was after getting arrested in 2013 that Kurt finally checked himself into rehab and got clean. And ever since that day, this is a state he's remained in. And after this, he'd returned to the ring, initially in TNA, then for one last WWE run during the late 2010s for a retirement tour. So knowing things worked out so well for the Olympic gold medalist, let's move on to our next subject, another wrestler who managed to beat addiction in recent years. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Mike Bennett? Now, Mike Bennett might not be as big of a name as some of the other people we've looked at today already, but that doesn't mean his story is any less impressive. No, addiction is the same for everyone, regardless of your status, and the present-day Kingdom member certainly had a lot of issues with this throughout the majority of his career. Yes, we're talking as far back as his days in Ring of Honor where, alongside his tag team partner Matt Taven, he became a 3-time ROH Tag Team Champion. And we're also talking about his time in TNA where he won the X Division title on one occasion. Yes, there was rarely a point while Mike Bennett was an active wrestler that he wasn't struggling with substance abuse. The thing is that there were just so few people who knew about it at the time, and that's why it came as a shock to many to learn that, after he signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2017, he'd be checking himself into rehab, and in the process, successfully got sober. And it appears this has been something which has continued for Bennett ever since that point. Sure, he might not work for WWE anymore, but he does have a job with AEW and Ring of Honor. And all the while he's working there, he's doing so safe in the knowledge that he doesn't have to rely on any substances in order to get him through the day anymore. Now, in 2025, Mike Bennett can live a clean and sober life, and that has to be the greatest victory of all for him, because so many in his situation never got to that point, especially not in the industry he works in. But it's not always this kind of thing that a performer has to overcome in order to get a second chance. No, sometimes it can be a life of crime someone has to put in their rearview mirror, a life of crime that sees them land in prison for a while. And that's a statement which can certainly be applied to our next subject, MVP. Yes, back when he was a young man, Alvin Burke found himself falling into a life of crime when he joined a street gang in Miami. And this eventually led to him getting caught committing armed robbery and being sentenced to 9.5 years behind bars. Obviously then, this could have been the end of so many things for the youngster, but he was able to turn the whole thing into a positive, because while locked up, he straightened out and vowed to remain on the right side of the law after leaving prison behind. Would he be able to do this? Yes. Ever since that point, the man now known as Montel Vontarius Porter has been able to make a career for himself inside of the squared circle, with much of his early run being spent in WWE during the 2000s. But even after the 2000s came to an end, MVP would continue to go strong, with his allegiance with Bobby Lashley in particular carrying on through multiple different promotions, be that TNA, WWE, or AEW. Hell, in 2025, he and Lashley remain a team, along with Shelton Benjamin as the Hurt Syndicate in AEW. And while Montel rarely wrestles himself anymore, his excellent mic skills have been put to good use in his role as manager to the current AEW Tag Team Champions. Yes, negative things happening don't have to be the end of the world, and MVP is living, breathing proof of that. Hell, even outside the wrestling ring, he's been able to achieve a lot, as in the world of martial arts, he's a legitimate black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, with this allowing him to win multiple tournaments in the discipline. In fact, there seems to be little MVP can't do if he sets his mind to it, and for that reason, he should serve as a motivational story to anyone, as second chances are always possible. But then everyone we've looked at today has shown a redemption story is only a few steps away.